When I was a college teacher, I actually enjoyed teaching freshman composition. Unlike most professors, they may not admit it, but that's just the trenches for them. They hate it. And the reason I loved it is because I would teach what we called critical thinking back then. I would have certain topics, and there was not a right or a wrong answer, but you had to present your case logically. You had to define your terms and take a position and develop it coherently, objectively. One of our best topics ever was the distinction between nature and culture, or even just talking about culture. What is it? It's such a big deal in our society and our politics today. You're supposed to respect people from different cultures. You're not supposed to be ethnocentric or a cultural imperialist. But what is culture? The word colere in Latin means to cultivate, to uh, nurse something along as a garden artificially. A garden is not natural. You know, plants in nature are choked by weeds, and some of them have to be watered more than rainwater that naturally comes. You have to, do things to get them to prosper. And so, human culture, the idea is that there's something artificial about it. It has to be tended to lovingly or otherwise, but there's a lot of deliberate application that goes into sustaining it. Nature, on the other hand, would just be what happens when things run wild. It's how things were created to be. Now, this is kind of a shallow distinction when you start to really ponder it. Uh, if nature is things as we were, people as they were before they formed into groups, then what made them form groups? What was the artificial pressure that brought them unnaturally together? And then all the rest of the stuff started to happen, like all the customs and the laws and the habits. Um, I suppose you could say there are basically two different theories about that. There's the Thomas Hobbes theory that we in the jungle were running around wild like a bunch of ravening individualists, raping and killing and taking everything we selfishly could. But because most of us were not really strong enough to survive against the few really powerful apes that were out there fighting against us, we formed into these cliques and we could resist the powerful individuals, but so that we as a group could also function effectively, we agreed to abide by certain laws. And then there's the romantic, the Rousseauvian, the Jean-Jacques Rousseau version of the individualist, which is kind of the same thing, except to Rousseau, the jungle is a place where the wild man, the hairy ape who's running around out there, is free, and his instincts are so natural and untrammeled that that's as good as it gets. And as soon as people start to degenerate into these cultural groups, they lose their freedom. They kind of lose their instinctive desire to do whatever they want, and they start doing what the group wants them to do. Well, the problem with both of these theories is that they're just not true. We can tell that by looking at what actually happens in fundamental human societies, because it is fundamental, it is natural for humans to live in societies. Look at hunter-gatherer groups. You don't ever find, and there's no evidence that human beings ever existed in these scattered little pockets of individuals. We have always been social animals. So we think of it this way. It's natural for us to be artificial. We will naturally form groups, and when we do so, those groups will acquire a certain set of rules. I would imagine, this isn't my area, I don't study this, but I would imagine that if you stretched the word a little bit, you could say that culture even applies to what's observable in groups of gorillas or chimpanzees. They have certain protocols that they live by, and those aren't really things that are hardwired in their DNA because they're things that have to be taught to each youngster growing up in the group. So it's, again, paradoxically, it's natural, isn't it, for human beings to have a culture. Artifice is natural to us. Now, so where does this leave us in terms of should we respect our different cultures, or should we resist culture and try to get back to nature? This is going to be a tennis match that has no end, and I can tell you right now that when I wrap up this video, we will not have answered the question's not really answerable in the terms that I've posed it. You could criticize culture as being unnatural and in the Rousseauian sense as being wrong because it oppresses the freedom that's in us all, but we've already established that that's kind of idiotic because culture is natural to us. And by the same token, though, culture is not necessarily good just because it's culture, is it? There's some terrible things that have been done in the name of culture. There are things that to this day that we human beings do to each other, and we do them because our ancestors did them, because we've been brought up doing them. It's part of our culture, and they're bad. They're really bad things. I guess the preeminent example would be human sacrifice. I don't think we practice that now, but we certainly have for time out of mind in the past, or things like mutilation of various sorts. Female genital mutilation is still practiced in many parts of the world. Even things that are morally fairly neutral, like, certain cultures put weights in their ears so that they get these really long ears, or they press infants, their foreheads with boards so that they have elongated skulls, or they do things to deform their face because for some reason in the culture that's thought to be a sign of honor or prestige or whatever. But again, it's not morally offensive in the way that an outright permanent mutilation would be. But why would you have to do that to establish an identity? This is the defense that's made on behalf of culture. Oh, it's their identity. You have to respect their culture because they draw their identity from that. What if I don't want to have the long earlobes all the rest of my life? I mean, why do I as an individual have to take my identity from my culture, even if it's not necessarily recommending that I do something that is morally dubious or just outright morally atrocious? Culture is not necessarily bad, though, because we do learn. Where do we acquire our knowledge of morals? Well, that gets into a whole other discussion. But the simplistic and the wrong answer, if you push it far enough, is that we get it from culture. But certainly, cultures lend themselves in many cases to preaching, to transmitting messages of a moral content to the next generation. This is brainwashing. It's cultural conditioning. So strictly speaking, it cannot be the same thing as morality. A moral choice has to be a choice that's freely made by a person that is an adult, is a functional adult, has a sane, developed intelligence, can identify different options and choose among them. Freedom is a prerequisite for moral choice. If you're culturally conditioned, if you're brainwashed to behave in a certain fashion, then you're not capable of making moral choices. So to say that we acquire a morality from culture is a contradiction. On the other hand, to say as I did a moment ago, that cultures uh, can program people to do things that are wicked, implies that we have another source that's distinct from culture, kind of some sort of inner light, a conscience that tells us what's truly right and wrong. So is that natural? Well, it's not natural in a Darwinian sense of the word, or again, we would be right back into determinism. If we're hardwired, if it's in our DNA to know that human sacrifice is wrong or that eating other people is wrong, then that would not involve a choice either. That would be something like the fear impulse or the need for sleep, or what, it would just be in your biological chemistry, and you wouldn't be able to resist it, and that too could not be moral. So we're left here at the end of this introductory video, and I'm going to try to follow this up with some other talks that carry this discussion into our chaotic, self-contradictory shooting match that we call politics. But I leave this discussion off just by hoping that you notice that we have not solved anything here. Cultures don't necessarily deserve respect. Just because they exist doesn't mean that they're good cultures, that they're morally good, that they produce good, healthy, responsible adult people. Why would we say that individuals draw their identity from culture? That's treating people like little pawns on a chessboard. That's not granting them any freedom at all. On the other hand, just to leave people as nature creates them is also ridiculous. If we're talking about nature in a Darwinian sense, because it is natural for us to form cultures. And if you took a bunch of people as children, like the novel Lord of the Flies, if they didn't really have much acculturation, and you just released them as little children on a desert island, and somehow they managed to grow up and survive, they would develop their own culture. You can't have a group of people that doesn't have a culture of some kind. So we're at an impasse here. There's really no political or moral answer at this point to these questions that we're posing. And as we do so often in this brainless modern world of ours, we're just throwing these words around without really considering their deeper implications. So let's look into this further later.